This is the subject of this is population is the subject of lesson 2. Before we go there, I want to make sure that we've covered most everything that I wanted to cover over here in the first lesson, which has a lot of stuff from Milton Friedman, I understand, but Milton Friedman's one of my own personal heroes. But what I wanted to make sure was we know the difference between excludability and non-excludability or non-excludable resources. We know the difference between rival resources and non-rival resources. We know which one of those combinations leads to the tragedy of the commons. Well, it's a resource that is either excludable or non-excludable and rival or non-rival. So which two are they? Rival and non-excludable, okay? So rival and non-excludable resources are common resources. And those are the ones that often are, can suffer from tragedy of the commons because there is an incentive to use, there's an incentive to exploit the resource, but there's no incentive to really save the resource, okay? And in that video, if you're able to look at it, it compares an extractive resource like, and renewable resource like tuna with an agricultural operation producing fryers or broilers, chickens. For meat purposes. So in agriculture, of course, you're looking to sustain the production of whatever it is you're doing in some way, although agricultural activities aren't always sustainable. They're not always long-term sustainable. But in the case of renewable resources versus non-renewable resources and depletion, recall that I made the argument, or at least I tried, that it's usually non-renewable resources that really don't reach a point to actual depletion, okay? And I tried to make the point that it's renewable resources that are often the most in danger of actual depletion, primarily because they're biological, right? And in the case of tuna are renewable, marine fisheries are renewable resources, but we depend on that population replicating or reproducing itself in natural processes. But if we wipe the population out so much, then they may not be able to recover. Now, there have been some fantastic recoveries of population wipeouts in terms of animals and vegetation and that sort of thing. So, you can be an optimist or you can be a pessimist, but in the case of marine fisheries, there's some serious problems that need to be resolved, and it's often because there is a lack of excludability. So what does that really mean? Excludability is really all about property rights. If there are no clear property rights, then it's a race to grab them, right? Anybody ever been in some sort of rush to get as much as you possibly can in any sort of sense like that? Maybe it was a game somewhere. Maybe it was. Anybody ever been in a situation like that? I bet you have. And when I think it was when my daughter was in like 3rd grade. This was a long time ago. All right, probably before you were born. She was in 2nd or 3rd grade, and she won at her school. There was, did you all ever sell cookie dough at school? Okay, you remember those? Then they would have a carnival for all the kids, that sold cookie dough. It sold so much. And then, anyway, she wound up winning this chance to go into this money booth, all right? This was really funny. She went into this money booth. Have you ever seen a money booth? You know what I'm talking about? Dollar bills. Yes, you go in. It's like a phone booth, and there's a fan on the floor, and they dump dollar bills, in this case, dollar bills, into the place, and it's blowing all around. And she had to, for every dollar she caught, she got to stick in her pocket or something or hold on to, and she got to keep it. And so anyway, it was hilarious to kind of watch, the trying to grab the money. But she won a pretty good chunk, I think, I remember. But anyway, she's rushing to try to catch it as much as she possibly can because, well, there's an incentive. She had like a minute to grab all the money, and after that minute was up, that was it, right? So, she's not competing against anybody, really, just competing against time. Have you all ever been in a situation where you're rushing to try to get as much as possible out of something before someone else does? Yeah.
Like when we go sand bass fishing, we take the barbs off all of our hooks and you only use single hooks because when you get into a school of them feeding, I mean, we're trying to catch as many as we can before they stop schooling.
While they're having to pull a hook out of a mouth, that's really fast stuff. Wow. And there are a lot of sand bass that go around, by the way. They reproduce pretty quickly. I mean, there are other examples, but from say the history of Oklahoma, there are examples. Before 1934, before there was something called the Interstate, what was it? The Interstate Commerce Commission or something like that. During the 1930s is when oil production began to be regulated, and it was largely regulated by the actions of a guy by the name of E.W. Marland, who was former governor of Oklahoma, and also founder of Marlin Oil, which later became Continental, essentially. But E.W. Marlin, before the 1930s, the oil fields of Oklahoma and Texas and Louisiana and California would be exploited in a boom and bust cycle, right? And the boom and bust cycle was all about discovery. You discover the resource, and then it's a race to tap and exploit the resource as fast as possible, because if you didn't, somebody else would. So the idea was that there is a finite amount of petroleum in this pool or in this play or whatever you want to call it, and it was a race against time and against your competitors to get as many wells in the ground as possible. So you would see these old photographs from the 19-teens and 20s. You've probably seen them in restaurants around town, where you have a literal forest of wooden oil derricks, and these were they went up all at the same time, and they're all punching boreholes in the ground trying to get at the petroleum. And once they do strike it, once they do draw it out, then they've got a problem of storage. All right, so they would often have to they wouldn't have enough facilities to store the crude, and before they could get it to market, so they would dam up creeks and just flood make a pond or a lake of petroleum, with the intention of later drawing it off. Crazy stuff. In fact, one time over by Cushing, Oklahoma, around Drumright, there was so much petroleum in the creeks, it was all over the county basically. Thunderstorm came through and started igniting petroleum, and so it just all a lot of it went up in flames. So you had these like massive. If you've ever seen a crude oil fire, it's kind of smoky. Heavy black smoke, and it was just all over the place for a long time. Anyway, the other problem is that, once you've extracted all this resource, right, what's going to happen to the price of the commodity? Well, if it's actually being marketed, then you've got sudden oversupply, right? And the people who are buying crude oil to process it, to refine it into gasoline or whatever use it for, you're not going to need it so much. The price is going to fall. So you got this boom and bust cycle. The boom is the race to get as much of it as you possibly can before the bust happens, and the bust is coming. Everybody knows that, right? So you got to get it and get it sold before the price collapses. So that boom-bust cycle was pretty typical of oil fields around Oklahoma, Texas, until that Interstate Commerce Commission began to regulate production. And, who are the people who are wanting to regulate production? The oil companies.
Shocker.
Pardon?
Shocker.
Well, yeah, they wanted the regulation because it was only hurting everyone whenever the price would collapse. So this is often the case. It's often the people utilizing the resource who are first to get some kind of regulation. And this kind of goes back to that idea of predator versus prey. In some ways, predators are the best friends of their prey animals, right? Because they know they depend on them. They have to depend on them. But things like predator territoriality is one way to disperse the predators and therefore reduce the competition on the prey species. So in terms of needing conservation, it's often the people who are most closely associated with the resource who want to preserve it the most. So in the United States, those who, the way that market hunting stopped or was regulated eventually was the rise of conservationists who were hunters. Hunters were the ones who stopped market hunting and had it finally outlawed. All right. So anyway, have a look at this stuff. There are a lot of terms, that sort of thing. And there's a video about trying to enact some regulation on the high seas outside of the boundaries of states. Okay, and there are a few other examples here of some of the some examples provided in these Friedman videos, such as the Jevons paradox and Hotelling's rule. These are economic principles that are associated with natural resources and utilization of natural resources. There's this real odd problem in which it may be the case that you can't get an innovation to replace a resource that is unsustainable if you conserve the resource. All right? And this is bizarre, but sometimes it may take the utilization of the resource as much as possible before there's an economic incentive to allow innovation to replace the resource. You can read more about that. I'm going to talk more and more about population, and finally, when we talk about prices, I really like this video about the idea of what a price is, because we'll see that a lot of our natural resource dilemmas, particularly in the United States during the 19th century, have to do with underpricing. All right, and the reason they were underpriced, well, there are a lot of reasons, but there was this idea of inexhaustibility for a long time in the United States. Nobody imagined that you could ever, there was so much abundance that we'll never use all that. It's sort of the idea of we'll never possibly run out of a resource. So there was always this perceived surplus, this perceived low price, and by by allowing prices to stay low or to have them perceived to be artificially low, led to a lot of overexploitation, which then caused some people to say, wait a minute, we got to stop this. And the idea of conservation is associated with that need to slow, or that need to at least preserve some of the resource for later use. So conservation, conservationists, remember, by definition, conservationists are not people who say, don't use the resource. They're those who are making the argument that if we're going to use this resource, we need to make sure that it is being utilized efficiently as possible, okay? And after the 1960s, the environmental movement began to take that conservation argument to a different level, so that there became sort of a merging of philosophies of conservation with preservation. And so often it's the case now where a resource is not even considered a resource anymore. It's considered something to be preserved and protected only. Okay? And then there is this this idea of, well, getting back to price, remember what a price is. The wonderful thing about a price is that it's reflecting, as long as the price is reflecting a market and the actual market economy without some kind of distortion, then a price is wonderful, because it allows us to know it allows us to know something about the item or about the good without having to know everything there is to know about it. So a price, I'm going to use this in a different class later today, but take this example. I didn't know how much a flight to London would be, but now you can fly out of Stillwater, right? So you can literally fly from Stillwater to London. Well, a few changed flights, right? But what do you think the going rate if you flew, and it'd be American Airlines, I guess, from Stillwater to London over, let's say you're smart and you buy your ticket 6 weeks in advance. What's the cheapest you're going to pay if you just go online to flights and that sort of thing? What's a pretty good price for a flight to London these days with 6 weeks advance?
Like $350.
London, England, not London.
You can get a ticket to China for $350.
350?
For sure.
Okay, not right now.
I paid like $600 or $700 to go to Florida from here.
Okay.
1,300.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, I just quickly looked up, and the cheapest flights I could find around $1,100, okay, to London. I mean, you can pay a lot more than that if you really want to, like $2,500 if you want. But $1,100, okay. Well, that right there prevents me from getting to London anytime soon, okay? Now, in the 1800s, they started building canals in places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. And what some of those canals did, in fact, you know about the Erie Canal, right? The Erie Canal created a drop in the price of freight almost overnight in 1825 when it opened up. It caused the price of freight between Buffalo, New York, that Buffalo's on Lake Erie, and Albany, New York, on the Hudson. Okay, one end of Lake Erie to the other. It reduced the rate of freight transportation from Buffalo to Albany from about $1,000 per ton. No, excuse me, $100 per ton to $10 per ton. Now, that's an $1,825, but roughly $100 per ton per mile. No, yeah, $100 per ton to $10 per ton. So imagine the flight today, the flight from Stillwater to London, England, dropping from $1,100 to $110. Let's take a field trip, right? Suddenly it opens it up, right? Suddenly it's quite accessible. And so what is that going to do to activity? So the idea here is a price is, what would have to happen for, price of flights to drop like that? So, either nobody's going to want to fly, or suddenly we've got super, super cheap fuel, because most of the time you're paying for the fuel, right? That's a lot of fuel for each one of us, but actually airlines operate on a pretty slim profit margin, so most of that price is in fuel. Kerosene for the most part. All right, so you have this idea is that there must be some real serious innovation to push the price down like that. So the price is reflecting what's going on in the world, and that price is going to stabilize supposedly. But of course, regulation can affect the price, and the price can be distorted by government interventionism. So this is something that I want you to keep in mind. We'll talk more about prices and this sort of thing, but here are some study questions for you. Here's one. Does the Kenyan, this is from reflecting the video. How does the price system lead to the increasingly efficient use of resources? This is the idea of a price system that is functional and works. Now, finally, there is this quick little video that's titled Unintended Consequences, and this guy's an economist, but unintended consequences, or the sort of the law of unintended consequences, there are a lot of really good examples of very, very well-meaning ideas being played out and having detrimental effects, or even the opposite effect of what they are intended to fix, okay? And there are some really good examples of this, but I'll leave it to you to check that out. All right, well, let's talk about one, the Endangered Species Act, okay? How is that an example of one of the problems of unintended consequences? Historic preservation is something I've been involved with over the years, and I've noticed the very same thing with the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. It actually preceded the Endangered Species Act, but it's kind of related. So what the Endangered Species Act and the Historic Preservation Act do is they identify things that are of concern, of public value, supposedly, and something that is in need of protection, okay? And what has occurred, for example, is oftentimes if someone discovers the presence of a so-called endangered species on their property, okay, then that is a green light for the federal government to perhaps declare eminent domain and take the property, or to be able to control the use of the property by the landowner. So the Endangered Species Act, okay, has been, there's several examples of the Endangered Species Act gives an incentive to the private landowner, to the private sector, that to avoid any potential loss of your rights for land use, you better not find an endangered species on your land, right? So what happens to the endangered species?
Get wiped out.
Yeah, it's shot and buried as soon as it's found, right? So the Endangered Species Act, the way that it's enacted, certainly didn't intend for that to happen, but people have incentives and people have disincentives to cooperate for whatever reason. In the historic preservation realm, the way that historic preservation works is It's actually a lot of paperwork and a lot of bureaucracy, but a lot of people perceive it to work in a way that doesn't really work. That is, they believe that if their property is declared to be historical, then well, maybe they'll get free money to rehabilitate that historic property, which doesn't happen. Or they'll think, well, I'm going to lose the ability to use my own property the way I want to. Okay? And so they will do their best not to allow it to be recognized as historic, as a historical property. So it's a matter of property rights here versus regulation in most of these examples. Okay, well, let's move on. Any questions before we move on to a different lesson? I mean, we're only like, 6 months into the class, and not quite that far, but, the class doesn't last at 6 months. Let's see, let's look at some more modules here and go to some more, or go to we're in the first module. Let's go look at you might also notice that I opened up all of these quizzes now so that you can see these. And this is actually kind of a long lesson with a lot of videos in it that explain some things, so I'll try not to get too redundant because you can listen to me explaining things later. But each one of these sort of points or lessons could be covered on the exam and will probably be covered in the quiz that you can take for this. So I'm going to sort of breeze over some of this stuff. You can check it out online later. But there are some things that I'd like for us to understand with regard to population. I'll try to get into the things that are probably a little bit more challenging here. Human population growth, all right? Human population growth has usually been presented, and at least every time I had a class about human population, it was always presented as an out-of-control problem, okay? So this is something that we have to realize is really typical for a conservation or environmental conservation-minded course, that it's all about slowing things down and being conservative and conserving resources. And so the more people always mean more problems, right? That's not the only philosophy out there, as we'll see. Now that idea of slowing population growth as a good thing has been around for quite a while. Who's the person that we usually point to as sort of beginning this idea of that we should somehow control our population growth or else disaster is imminent? I'll give you a hint. His name starts with an M. And he was an Anglican clergyman in Great Britain.
Martin Luther?
No, that would have been
Thomas Malthusian.
Thomas Malthus.
Malthus?
Yes, Thomas Malthus. Okay, so maybe you've heard of Malthusian theory. Okay, so Thomas Malthus was the late 18th century, early 19th century Anglican clergyman and scholar type, and his most important essay is an essay on the principle of population, and let's see if I can get into this. Let's see here. These are basically some statistics. Oh, here we go. So here we go. Oh, very top. Okay. So I'll try to open some of this stuff so you can see it. Thomas Malthus, here he is. Looks like a kind fellow. And his idea was published in 1798. It's a relatively short book called An Essay on the Principle of Population. You can't read that, I know, but does anybody recall Malthusian theory and what he was arguing?
Yeah, he was saying that we're going to run out of food and resources to feed all the people if we keep growing so much, right?
If we keep reproducing, yeah, if we keep reproducing. And so he was worried. He was living in London, the south of England, during the early Industrial Revolution. This is a guy who is seeing cities grow like mushrooms. The city is growing very, very rapidly. People were rushing to the city to work in factories, and the factories were very dangerous, and the cities were dirty, and the air was dirty. And it was, the early Industrial Revolution in England was not pretty at all. So Malthus is kind of perceiving that, okay, we have this huge population in this relatively small island country, and we're producing food, but my gosh, how can we ever produce enough food for all of these people? His idea, he started theorizing, his ideas involved two different trajectories of growth. One was the trajectory of the growing production of food. Okay, so we can grow grain, we can raise livestock, we can produce food at such and such rate. And that rate was what he considered to be kind of a linear rate. Okay, so he has these two sort of rates of change over time. And he called the production of agriculture basically an arithmetic factor. So it's only going to change arithmetically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How can we increase our food production, by the way?
Technology.
Well, in his day, you could say there are really two ways. You can increase the amount of land you have in production, right? But you can only do that to a certain extent. You can't farm every square inch necessarily. So there's a finite resource in the land, okay? So our natural resource here is just soil, land. But then there's another problem. Human beings don't reproduce in a linear fashion. They reproduce in what he called not an arithmetic, but a geometric fashion. As you know, a curvilinear relationship. So, or an exponential rate, right? Sorry. Exponentially increasing human beings. We reproduce, back in the Industrial Revolution, they were having 10, 15 children per family, right? So these large families were coming to the city for the first time and working in factories. And it wasn't pretty. They were cramped in slums and so on. So Malthus says, we've got an issue here. We've got one rate of food production that's a straight line or a linear relationship, okay? And then we've got human population growth, which is a curvilinear relationship. Okay, it's going vertical any moment. And at some point in the future, our linear food production is going to be intersected by our curvilinear exponential human population growth. And where that intersects, bingo, is a problem because we're going to overshoot our ability to feed ourselves. Okay? You with me? That overshooting of the ability to feed ourselves, or the carrying capacity of the land, whatever that may be, to Malthus was the onset of a crisis. And the way that Malthus figured this would happen, and he had seen famines in the past and he knew about history, what he said was, okay, once the population hits that carrying capacity and overshoots the carrying capacity, then you're going to have people competing for resources, you're going to have war, you're going to have perhaps famine, And what always accompanies famine? Disease. And disease, war, and famine will eliminate a portion of the population. They will die out. He's, oddly referred to that as a positive check against population. Okay? So the population overshoots carrying capacity, and there's disaster, what we call a Malthusian disaster, which then pushes the population down a little bit. So everything kind of, and then you have the cycle coming back. And he envisioned this as a cyclical event over time. Okay? And Malthus, because he was an Anglican clergyman, said, we've got to do something to stop this absolutely inevitable disaster. How do we do that? We can only produce so much food. We can do that, and we try our work on technology as much as we can. But what we really have to do is figure out how not to have so many children, okay? Because we're going to continue to have this problem unless we figure out a way to stop having so many children. One problem with this was that he was an Anglican clergyman in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and his solution was chastity, or it wasn't even birth control, okay? It was just praying a lot, I suppose. I don't know. So there was not a lot of good ideas about how to fix this problem. Now later on when culture would change enough, this idea continued on. So I was born in 1966. Okay, I was a couple years after the end of the baby boom. What ended the baby boom in 1964, 65? Anybody know? Did Grandma and Grandpa quit having sex so much?
Roe versus Wade.
Well, I mean, yeah, maybe.
Another war?
Well, we were starting Vietnam, yeah, but that wasn't why.
Disease.
No. The birth control pill. The birth control pill became marketed in the mid-1960s. It was derived. I think it was invented, or it was developed around 1963, I think. But it didn't hit the market until about 65.
65.
Something like it, 64, 65. So here I am. Surprise, okay? And so anyway, my siblings are 8 and 10 years older than me. So I am a very, very lucky person. All of us are lucky just to have been born, by the way, right? I mean, what are the chances, if you know, so many million sperm, right? What are the chances that you are even in existence? I'm even in existence. I mean, it's tiny, minuscule, all right? It's an awesome amount of luck, all right, for us to even be here. Well, anyway, the idea of Malthus was taken up during the 1960s by other folks who became known as environmentalists. And there are, one of the most influential books that was, supposedly written by a scientist for a popular audience, came out in 19... what? 68. What a year, okay? And it was this book, The Population Bomb, okay? I don't know if you can see that. But The Population Bomb was written by a biologist by the name of Paul Ehrlich, and you can read about Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich is someone we would call a neo-Malthusian, a new Malthusian. So he was talking about the very same things that Malthus was talking about in England, except he was using the example of India and China in the 1960s. Okay? I remember when I wouldn't eat all of my food on my plate, which was very rare when I was a kid, and my mom would say something, and this was, I never understood what she meant by this, but she said, you need to clean your plate because there are people starving in China. Should we send this to China? No. Just, in other words, don't waste your own food because there are people around the world that would kill for that, or that would really, really be desperate and love to have what you have in front of your plate. She was trying to guilt me into it, So anyway, but this is one of the most popular approaches to population, and this is basically what I was handed as an undergraduate student and a graduate student, because in the 1980s and 1990s, it was still the case that in many parts of the world, population growth was so rapid that it was referred to as out of control, okay? Now, I'm going to tell you today that my own perspective is that there is not a population problem at all in the world, anywhere, period. Except there may be a population problem with some places not having enough people, okay? Not having enough babies, particularly. And this is the case in much of Europe, and has been for decades. It's going to be the case in China. There are going to be some serious, there's a new movie out, too, I think. Maybe you've seen that, about China's one-child policy. What's that called? Remember?
It's a girl. Right?
It's a girl?
Yeah, or something like that.
Oh, gosh. That's got to be a crazy one, then.
They showed it in another class I'm taking. Well, they didn't show it, but they showed the preview for it.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, this, so we've always, I've been told over, well, how do you explain then famines in Ethiopia or in Somalia? How do you explain famines in that case? North Korea, yeah, good example. In just about every case, you can explain famine by the presence of geographical borders and the existence of the state, the existence of governments, okay? It's not to say that famines haven't happened in the past. It's not to say that famines didn't precede the state or even politics. They probably did, but human beings were a lot freer in some cases. Well, and then there is a different approach to this, and I'm going to try to hurry. There is a very different approach to population that we might refer to as a cornucopian approach. In other words, if Ehrlich and Malthus were the pessimists, saying that we need to stop having babies, we need to forcibly sterilize millions of women in India against their will, against their culture, just to make sure that there are enough people, there's enough food in India, okay? Now that's a pretty steep call. Or in the case of China, a one-child policy that lasted from about 1979 to about, I think officially, 2018 or 2019, although it hadn't been enforced much at all for the last 20 years. So a one-child policy was something that stopped population growth, but it's going to have detrimental effects, and it is still having detrimental effects, and it will continue to have detrimental effects in the future. That's maybe arguable, but a different approach is the cornucopian approach, and that's the one that makes the point that, as Julian Simon made a point about it, that, okay, if human beings are capable of resolving issues like issues associated with natural resource use, overuse, exploitation, overexploitation, sustainability issues, if human beings are able to do that, then wouldn't it be the case that more human beings would be able to come up with greater solutions? So he had a book, he had a lot of books, but one of them was referred to as the ultimate resource. And to Julian Simon, the ultimate resource was the human brain, human ingenuity. He's of the mind that there's no such thing as there's really no such thing as resource depletion in the sense that you're going to run out of anything. And even made this bet. You ever heard of the Simon Ehrlich wager? Maybe you've read through this. The Simon Ehrlich wager is a pretty interesting story. It's about the bet that Julian Simon made with Paul Ehrlich. Two people who were, Ehrlich was a lot taller, but they were both from the same part of New Jersey. They were both Jewish, and they were both intellectuals. Julian Simon was an economist. Paul Ehrlich was a biologist. Okay, they made this. Julian Simon said, Paul Ehrlich, you're on the Tonight Show every few weeks, and you're getting your point across, and you're buffaloing everybody, and So he made this bet with him. He said, okay, Paul Ehrlich, you select a list of natural resources. We'll limit it to metal commodities. Okay, you select your metal, and in 10 years, if the price of that metal is not lower than it is today, then he would pay Ehrlich the difference in that commodity price. And if Simon was right that the price would fall, Ehrlich had to pay him the difference. Okay? And I'll let you look at the video to figure out what happened. Okay? You ever heard of that? The Simon Ehrlich wager? Okay. Check it out. And it has to do not just with population, but with scarcity and price, too. So have a look at that, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about some population stuff. We'll talk about the measures, population pyramids, that sort of thing. The demographic transition model. Great stuff. Okay? So, sayonara. It's been an odd week, hasn't it? Sorry. Snow day Wednesday. Wow. But there's a lot of stuff online now for you to check out, all right?